Great, thank you.
Oh, great.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to be here. Daniel had to listen to me talk his ear off at Dreamforce about this topic. But it's been a topic that I've been really excited about since being a data scientist in industry. Sort of had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies prior to joining Salesforce, and very quickly became obvious that as an expert in the space, it's not just about being good at building models, but also around introducing kind of those next level conversations. For example, these types of topics that are really important. So I'm so excited to hear about what everybody on this panel has to say. Some awesome conversation hopefully to come. So absolutely, we're gonna open up questions to everyone, but I sort of wanted to start off with just having everyone share kind of what, their exposure to this space and how they first became interested in this topic.
I guess that means I get to start because I have the mic. So, hello everyone, my name's Joy Bonaguro. Until very recently, like we're counting in the weeks, I was the first chief data officer of San Francisco, your city and county. And yeah, woo! Yeah. Hopefully you've used our data that you could download from datasf.org. I most recently joined a cybersecurity startup, corelight.com, and we are always hiring as well. And before I jump in with my story, I want to congratulate the organizers on this all-female panel. Because how many people are familiar with the blog, Congrats, you have an all-male panel? Check it out. It's a real thing. So this is rad, and especially given the topic area, it's extra rad. So thank you, organizers. So how did I get here? So City and County of San Francisco. So when I joined the city, I was given two broad missions. One, revitalize our open data program. Open data is about the proactive publication of machine-readable data. And then two, help the city use data better, which is sort of like a big, giant, poorly defined challenge. And we're not going to go through that history, but what it eventually led to was most recently, about a little over a year ago, we introduced a new service called Data Science SF. You can go to my now old website, I'm still transitioning here, where you can learn about what we're doing. And our goal of Data Science SF was to demonstrate that data science, ML, AI, is something that the city needs to be doing. And I have so many stories about what we've done, but a few of them just very quickly. One, we've learned how to collect taxes more efficiently using machine learning. I'm sure you're excited about that. And actually you should be excited about it because it's a more actually democratic process now, and I'm sure that'll come out in the discussion. But more importantly, we did things like identified mothers and babies at most likely to drop out of nutrition programs. So we also helped the airport better forecast flights and passengers. We also identified people who are most likely to recidivate into emergency services coming from homelessness. So the power of algorithms and AI and government is more or less infinite and immense. But at the same time that we were doing this and rolling out our data science service and having a lot of interesting stories, which again, you can find at datasf.org, we recognized that we were introducing new tooling in an environment that was often the domain of government workers or bureaucrats making those decisions or framing those decisions. And we recognized the ethical implications of that. And so we said, well, what should we do? And we looked around at the landscape and everyone's like, oh my God, ethics and bias in AI, disaster zone, especially in the public space. And while the hand-wringing, confirmed our own concerns, it wasn't very helpful. So what we set about doing was we partnered with Harvard and Johns Hopkins to develop the Ethics and Ethics and Algorithms Toolkit, and we actually beta launched it in September at the Data for Social Good, Bloomberg's Data for Social Good conference in New York. So it's online, it's called, I have it somewhere. It's called, ethicstoolkit.ai. And it's a toolkit that we launched and we designed for governments using data science and AI. And essentially, it's a process-based risk management approach to use that responsibly. And so that's sort of the perspective that I'm coming from. And our toolkit's in beta. We're looking for feedback. It's designed for governments, but we do think it's essentially a risk management-based process designed to mitigate ethical risk and use of AI. And I'll stop talking.
Okay, that's hard to follow. Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm an industry analyst. So my job is basically to learn about things and explain it to people, either using by research reports or stuff like this, keynotes, talking, that kind of thing. And my background, like I have a background in kind of literature, but then the beginning of my career, I was in marketing and discovered to my immense relief I was a terrible marketer because I was always the person who was asking if we were really ready to go out with that campaign. And very unpopular, I have to say. And so what was the natural next step was for me to take the thing that everybody hated about me and turn it into a positive, so I became an analyst where it's my job to ask those questions. And so the way that I got involved at the beginning was that I had been pretty involved in the early days of social media, and one of the things that really interested me was social data, so data from social media, what people share, why they share it, how they share it, and how, because my audience is primarily business, how businesses use it. And I saw a lot of issues with that. And I was a founding member of an organization back in, oh gosh, I think we started it in 2013 called the Big Boulder Initiative, which was actually came out of GNIP, which was acquired by Twitter back in those days. And the idea was actually to specifically look at the successful and ethical use of social media data. From there, it was a pretty easy jump into social data as a form of big data, right? Because it fulfills all the criteria, big data. It moves quickly, much of it is unstructured, lots of different varieties, lots of volumes. And then from there, I started thinking about the ethics of the way that we use data as organizations, because there were all these weird unintended consequences starting to show up in the news, things like the early story about Target and the pregnant girl, and all the ways in which if you start mixing data together, you can have these unanticipated consequences. So I started to try to convince my boss that I should write a report on ethical data use and trust. This was back in, I want to say 2014. And the response was, why? Nobody's asking for that. And so so I wrote it anyway, and because I figured somebody was going to be listening at some point. And then I got more interested in sort of, well, what makes data actually more powerful are algorithms. And so I wanted to write about algorithms and ethics, and nobody wanted to know about that either. This would have been 2016. So I wrote a report about the customer experience of AI. And it was, I mean, okay, let's just consider that we're all friends here, right? It was partly because if I said ethics, people moved away from me slowly. And it was partly because truly the way that, ethics are just digital, they're just norms of behavior, acceptable norms of behavior. And we don't really have that in the digital world. Like, we have things that we're starting to form, but like, it's not mature in the way that that we sort of know, even if we don't follow those norms, we sort of know what is and isn't okay to do in these kinds of spaces. So the customer experience of AI is not just about the way that products and services work, but it's also the way in which we use data, because the more digital we become, the more organizations transform to becoming more digital, the more our experience of businesses and their experience of us comes through data. So that's really kind of what I do. And now I do a lot of talking to executives about AI and ethics, and a lot of talk to developers. I have to say, I'm not a data scientist, and I'm not an ethicist. I'm really just essentially a professionally curious person.
Thank you, Susan. So Ayori Selassie, I'm a product marketing manager at Salesforce for the Einstein platform. So if you've heard of Einstein Prediction Builder or any of those different products, those are the products that I support and lead go-to-market for. When it comes to ethics and why I'm so passionate about this topic, I don't know if anyone noticed in the room, but I'm of African descent. And, and in this room, we actually have quite a lot of gender and ethnic diversity in the room. I think that's really awesome. Great job, Daniel. But but most rooms that I have been in since I was about 14, 15 years old when I started working in technology here in Silicon Valley were not this diverse. And what that meant for me was that I was kind of always the person looking at these different technologies that we were developing and saying, when is this going to be accessible to the most marginalized populations? What impact does this technology have on very marginalized populations? And that might be people who have immigrated to the United States or other countries. It may be people who have grown up in impoverished communities, people who don't have a credit score, for example, or maybe they've gone through bankruptcies, or maybe they've been in jail. Different things that have happened that tend to happen to people who are on the lower scale of the lower spectrum of the economic scale. And I specifically think about those things because I was very poor growing up. And so my experience coming up through technology and actually, you know, just being around billionaires every day, but having a very different perspective has always made me very sensitive to these issues. And I think it's very important that as we're building this technology, and you are all developers and you're all creating incredible applications, you have this incredible agency to make sure that you're making technologies that has a positive impact on the world. Should you choose to use it that way or not is up to you. But I have. And so some of the ways in which I have been able to focus on doing that is, now I'm not speaking on behalf of Salesforce, I'm speaking on behalf of Ayori. I run a campaign, a social media campaign called Think, Don't Squeeze. And what we do is we basically help advocates, activists, organizations, emergency response community leaders to collaborate together to build solutions that help people in society. So for example, people who have been victims of violence, people who have family members who are incarcerated, people who are trying to recover from previous incarcerations. All of these different things, people who are living without homes. I don't like to use the term homeless because if you live in San Francisco, this is your home. You may live on the street, but you're not homeless. This is your home. You just don't have a house. So these are some of the different things that I'm very, very passionate about in helping people to collaborate together to build better solutions by using technology. And specifically, I think artificial intelligence has the capability of being a great equalizer. And oftentimes, I think you'll hear artificial intelligence referenced in the spectrum of it's actually it's destabilizing communities or increasing the economic gap. But I think because artificial intelligence has the ability to expose all of those biases, it has the ability to expose the gaps and the assumptions that we make about people. We can actually make those corrections as a society now. And so I'm really pleased to be on this panel with these incredible people who are also working in that way. And my mission is to make this conversation as accessible as possible for everyone else. So whether you're a data scientist or not, whether you're an admin or a developer, or you're an analyst, or you're just an activist, that you can use these technologies and you can participate in this dialogue. Because the more voices we have in this conversation, the more we're going to be able to actually solve these problems for society.
It was wonderful. I love hearing all these experiences. I think there are a lot of follow-on questions that could come from the group, but maybe I would just want to kick it off with one, which is I think everyone on this panel has this really fascinating perspective about what motivated you to move into this space and to start discussing it. But I'm curious from your perspective, looking at an organization or when you're empowering people in this room to make change in their day-to-day lives, when you think about an organization that's going to be using AI, who do you think within the organization is actually responsible for ensuring kind of that ethical use and how to go about monitoring it? Does anyone have kind of a perspective on that side?
You've got the microphone.
I know, but that's just after you start.
I'm super passionate about this. So I actually think it's everyone's responsibility, right? Thank you. See, and I think the hard part is lending agency to everybody to be responsible in that process. And I actually think that artificial intelligence, especially, is a technology that organizations who are building artificial intelligence need to really take a lot of effort to make it as collaborative as possible. Like, how can you ensure that when you're testing models or when you're testing use cases, that the folks that you have coming in to evaluate that for your focus groups and things like that are a diverse representative group of the population? Not only your direct customers who will be using it, but also representative of your customers who will be impacted by it. So if you're a financial services company and you're building algorithms to predict who's going to be approved for a loan, are you exposing these technologies to the folks that ultimately we would be needing to apply for these loans across the spectrum? And so I think if you're a business analyst, if you're a developer, if you're a quality engineer, like project manager, all of those roles need to start taking the steps to educate themselves on this process so that they can be equally responsible for their contribution.
Can I do a little deeper, or not deeper, but like another dive on that? So I totally agree. I think this is one of the things that's happening, and I kind of have this fun job here because I can say the stuff that the Salesforce people can't say. So one of the things I'm hearing a lot lately are there any data scientists in the room aside from Sarah? So just a few. Okay, so one thing I'm hearing from data scientists is that a lot of these issues that we're talking about with AI and bias are tending to get pushed off onto the data scientists. And fundamentally, the big change that we're dealing with is that we're moving from rules-based technologies to probabilistic technologies based on statistics, therefore based on math. And a lot of people think math is neutral. So if there's a problem with a data model and there's bias in it, it must be because the data scientists aren't doing their job. And that's a little bit of the conversation that's happening now, and I would really urge you to just call BS on that. Because by pushing it off on the data scientists, essentially you're just saying, well, the rest of us have no responsibility for how our technology is used. I'll give a quick example. Anybody a Turkish speaker in the room? Yeah, really? Do we have a Turkish speaker? Okay, maybe not. So Turkish, like some other languages, doesn't have a gendered pronoun. So you can do this in Google Translate on your own. If you take the phrase, she is a doctor, and you translate it into Turkish, it will come back, o bir doktor. If you take that sentence and you translate it back into English, it will say, he is a doctor. So you have now turned a woman into a man, magic, okay? I would venture to say that the Turkish language has been around longer than Google, and that Google should know this, right? That when you look at Google Translate, you should have a pretty decent indication that maybe the word doctor has about a 99.9% likelihood of being correct, but the pronoun, depending on how many doctors there likely are, female versus male versus non-binary versus whatever, is not as clear. And so when you have these unclear situations or these situations that should require additional analysis, you need to let people know about that, because the Turkish language is not about to change because of AI. So, so that's one example where maybe the English language should, I mean, let's all go to, frankly, let's just blend. Because it's not just a binary world, obviously. So I mean, there are lots of different ways in which we as humans and our language and the way to express ourselves, and the way that we translate into math don't jibe with each other in a way that is human and positive. So what I'm saying in terms of responsibility is, yes, data scientists should raise those issues. User interface people should understand what those issues are too, so that they can flag things. People who are in compliance and legal and audit, there should be, and there are, I think, people working on things like adversarial techniques that can reveal bias in data, because it is a mirror. And there should be people in communications who are trying to communicate these issues and evangelize, very much the way that we're trying to do that tonight. So this is a really, a shared responsibility, and I'd venture to say there probably isn't a person in an enterprise or any kind of business who isn't either affected by this personally or doesn't have a responsibility.
I'm not the kind of person who's like, oh, there's a question, all three need to talk. But I will just add how to operationalize this I agree with everything that's been said. And something that I love to think about analogies, and I think when we're talking about ethics and AI, an analogy is sort of the privacy world in a lot of ways. And the way you operationalize these conversations, we're not going to like automate how to make algorithms on bias, right? That it's going to be a human-driven and a human-based process to really think through the implications of where and how you're using the AI. And yes, there will be technical mitigations around mitigating bias, but a lot of it's thinking through what are the implications of this and having a structured way of digesting that, which is why we sort of went with this risk-based, process-based approach to managing it.
It's wonderful. I encourage anyone who has a question at any point to also raise your hand so that I can be aware of them. So I guess following up on some of what was just said, I think everyone is stating that the responsibility lies with the entire organization, all individuals. With that, though, it sounds like this like desire to have something measurable, a metric, some way to surface it, introducing visibility is very important. So does anyone have like examples to share on like how this was effective, maybe something that could be implemented by someone here in the room?
I mean, I'll just jump in quickly, sort of building on my last comment, which is that I think part of the measurability is demonstrating a responsible process, frankly. And if you don't have the ability to demonstrate that, oh yes, we thought through this, and then something bad happens, like then you have an issue. So if something terrible happens and there's no evidence that the organization thought through the implications, people are pretty unforgiving. If something bad happens and you made a good faith attempt and you tried to think through it and understand and discover and put in mitigations to discover the risks, that's a different situation. That's being a learning organization, and an organization that's striving to be ethical. You will not be 100% ethical all the time, but have you put in the organizational benchmarks and stops in order to do that? Do you have an internal audit committee? Do you bring in, we're gonna see third-party certification things emerge around this space, right? In the same way we do for our financial management. And so there is going to be a trust environment that evolves where it's internal, third-party, training, certifications. Like we're going to see that all happen. We're just at the beginning.
Yeah, and I would also say that we're at the beginning of this journey. Right? So what we're looking for is to make this a collaborative experience where people can experiment and learn together. I mean, traditionally, this kind of conversation has been pretty exclusive to data scientists like, Suzanne over there and Sarah over there, right? Not everyone has had an opportunity to participate in this because not everyone has had the ability to create artificial intelligence. And what we've experienced is now that the technologies are becoming more readily available to more people, this is an opportunity for more people to blaze a trail around how to do this the right way. And I mean, I remember when the internet was a new thing, right? Like, how many people remember someone asking them, is this internet thing gonna stick around, right? Right? And how many people remember saying like, iPhone, that's stupid. Why would you want to touch the phone? Like, I know somebody in here said that. So, we're at that point with artificial intelligence and ensuring that our technology is ethical. And like, I'm really excited about the direction that Salesforce is going in. I don't have a bunch of details that I can share, but if you watch the keynote earlier this year, Mark got up and he said that we're, really committed to figuring out how to drive an ethical use of technology. And to have an executive like that stand up and say that this is not something that the industry has figured out, but we're committed to doing it, that's really powerful. And that is essentially giving you all the license to do the diligence, to put in the work, because people really care all the way up to the top, and you're going to get the kind of support that you need if you thought that you didn't have it before.
Yeah, absolutely. The work that's happening, I know in Richard Socha's organization, like they're looking at AI ethics and bias remediation, and they're starting to look at how to infuse some of those practices and principles into the development process. So a few different highlights of things that are happening. So around bias remediation in images and in language, there's work happening in multiple academic contexts, in Microsoft, in Boston University, MIT, Stanford, various other places, nonprofits like the AI Now Foundation. So there's a ton of work happening in data science around this. There's a ton of work also happening among people in industry and academia who are looking at how do you make algorithms more explainable. So if you do have something that seems to be moving in a direction that's not consistent with your values, how do you fix that? There are examples coming out of IBM and also the AI Now Foundation. AI Now came out with an algorithmic impact assessment for public agencies. Basically, the idea that you would do this kind of similar to an environmental impact assessment. If you're going to build something, let's look at the impact on people of this particular process that's built with algorithms. And then IBM is asking its suppliers and partners to conform with ethical data use practices and things like that. I want to give one quick example from Airbnb that sort of pulls all these things together. So Airbnb, as I'm sure you know, had a year or so ago, there were a lot of stories in the news about some hosts on the platform not accepting bookings from people of color and not accepting bookings from LGBTQ folks. And the company, they don't talk about this a lot, but basically what they did was they took a look at what was happening and they decided to actually change the platform and do some social engineering. And so what they did was they built a function whereby if I'm a host and I get a booking from somebody and I see their profile picture and I say, I'm not letting them book, the platform will now ask me, oh, well, would you like to block the first week of October since your property is obviously not available? And then, maybe not with that tone, but like, you know what I mean? And then if I say no, it asks me why. And I have to answer. And so this makes the host, at the very least, have to face the fact that they're making a choice that is let's just say a more serious choice than just saying, well, I changed my mind. If I do this multiple times, I get kicked off. Now, that's cool in and of itself. But the other side of it is they looked at and yes, you can game it, and I'm sure they're looking at like what happens if I raise the price, or do all sorts of other weirdo things, which you can follow, right? Because this is data. But here's the other side of it. From a conversion standpoint, meaning, and also from a revenue standpoint, it's pretty much a wash. Because if I don't rent to person A here, I might rent to person B here. And Airbnb doesn't see an economic impact to that, right? It's negligible. And so what they had to do was say, okay, well, we measure conversions and we measure revenue in, and we also have these corporate values, and one of them is being a welcoming platform for everybody. And so we actually need a metric around whether we succeeded or failed around that. And so if we pass on conversion and we fail on trust, then we've failed. And I think that, is that perfect? Can you game it? Like, it's not perfect. I'm sure you can game it, all those things. But I think, like, that to me is a model of a company that's thinking in a more holistic way.
Another example? Yeah, I just want to add another example. Because in my community where we live, it's not exactly a gated community, but it's a little bit insular, like in the middle of a more poor community, like a wealthy community inside of in the middle of a poorer community. And we would get like a lot of people reporting like a suspicious activity. Oh, like there was a guy walking down the street with a hoodie, and I'm always like, seriously, I'm constantly triggered, and I'm like, people are like pointing out Trayvon Martins all the time. Like that's how I felt. And what I was, the story I want to share is that the platform next door that we use, does anyone use the platform next door? They did a really great thing, actually. They did a really great thing where if you want to report suspicious activity, it actually asks you what is suspicious about that person, right? And what did they do that made you feel uncomfortable? Because if it was just the fact that that was a brown person, or you know, if it was just the fact that that person was wearing a hoodie or something like that, is that really cause for you to be suspicious? So their platform started helping the users to inspect their own social bias, because the technology itself is not biased. The technology only reflects our human bias. So if we can start thinking more intelligently about how we build our technology, we can actually correct these issues in the data.
I think we have a question, yeah.
Is there a place, and I know you said this is the early days of AI and thinking about ethics in AI. Where can we go for best practices? If we're using Einstein, for example, we submit things for a model, to train a model, but that's kind of a black box, a serious thing that happens elsewhere, and they come back and they say, okay, we got your model trained for you. We don't know what's really going on there. I don't know if we're inadvertently building in bias.
So I'll just repeat the question. But it was, if we're using these tools that are out there that allow us to build models in an automated way, and we're not data scientists ourselves, how can we protect ourselves against it? How can we identify these problems?
Yeah.
And where can we go for best practices?
So these are actually conversations that we're having like regularly as a product team. I'm really proud that we're having these conversations. And so thinking about, are there ways where we can creatively identify certain types of fields that we know tend to trigger bias? Like, for example, gender, race. Like, we can easily identify that type of metadata in a set of objects. So we're talking about the different things that we can do to flag those type of things. Like, perhaps you should consider not including this field. It may bias your model in a way that you don't want. But it actually goes beyond that as well, because we can think of specific things that we kind of know tends to like trigger bias within us, race and gender and stuff like that. But zip code is often a proxy for ethnicity, right? For race. So those are things that live around the other kind of metadata that we also have to get more creative about identifying. And I have not yet seen any platform technically execute that in a really sophisticated way, but I certainly hope that our Einstein platform will be the first, and we're striving for that.
I just want to add one quick thing, which is if you are using proxy data, like zip code for, you know, something, then it is a place to start to look, because, you know, we've seen, like, for example, in the criminal justice system with the Compass system, which was this predictive policing system, essentially, or, all right, suggestive. Feel free. No, I was. Okay, this system that purported to predict things. Am I better?
I think their marketing.
Their marketing got ahead of them. Okay, this thing. You know, one of the, for example, one of the triggers of potential reoffending is maybe having a family member in the criminal justice system. Well, guess what? That kind of compounds bias in a way that isn't equally distributed across all people. And so once you start picking one thing to represent another, you're abstracting people even a little bit more and making assumptions. And so I would just say look for the proxies, because they may actually hide some stuff that that you wouldn't otherwise have found. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, that's totally fair. Yeah, sorry. There's a lot of vendors that are claiming they do predictive work, and a lot of them are just doing weird weighted things. So anyway, that's just nitpicking I have with Compass, nothing to do with you. So there's also ISO's working on a standard. So there's so many, there's like one group's working on sort of like a code of ethics for data scientists. So everyone and their mother's doing something. I worked on something, Einstein, I think, is trying to work it in their platform. I don't think I can say this with like 100% confidence. I don't think you'll ever figure out how to fully automate this. I think it needs to be an organizational conversation and process along with some things that can help. Because even if you think through your standards, even if you think through your standard proxies, bias can still crop up in unexpected places. And so I think I think the real risk is that as AI ends up everywhere, everything is going to be automated, that we might not be able to keep up. And so I don't have an answer for that. I think there's a lot of people that are working on and thinking about this, but until we see the field mature and the standards mature, I think we're all just gonna have to pay close attention and identify where are the riskiest places. Like, okay, if we're gonna be using AI that's going to have severe life or economic impact on someone, we need to be super careful, right? And so that's where the first step in a process-based approach is like, who's impacted about what and how, to what degree. And then that helps us immediately know where we need to spend a lot more time and sort of spread our resources and our thinking.
I feel like I'm talking too much already, but I mean, I think generally, like, you should just be asking yourself, like, who's excluded? Like, who haven't we thought of? Who might be marginalized by this system? Who are we targeting with this system? What does it mean for us to target these people and not another group of people, right? These are questions that we have to really interrogate as businesses, as organizations, as nonprofits, and we have to start to take that gut check of what that is going to mean on our larger society and if that is okay with us. And so I think being, first of all, making sure that as an organization, you're a values-driven organization, identifying what your values are, and then asking yourself, as you build the technology, are you representing those values in the world, in your society, in your workplace, with your customers, et cetera?
Well, thank you very much for this forum. I think this is fantastic, and I wish it will be done more often because people tend to plow through, be the first in line, be first adopters, so on, and they don't think about the consequences. My concern is the Minority Report type scenario where, for example, I would be very concerned if the police in Chicago started to use their data to figure out where to go policing. Basically, well, they're already doing that. My problem is like that data, I'm pretty sure, is biased. It's biased against people of color. And the fact that that data is biased is not, the idea that that data is biased is not accepted by people that want to use the system. For example, the police commissioner. So my concern is you cannot put this on the data scientists. You cannot put this on the people that are actually creating the system. So who tells somebody that is the GEICO principle, garbage in, garbage out? Who tells somebody that has a bunch of data that that data is basically unusable and it's crap, and you cannot use it for what you want to do, especially when you have politicians that want to be at the cutting edge, wants to create something. How do you, what would be the best way? I mean, it's an impossible question, but how do you approach decision makers with that information?
I can take a first crack. So, from a public and civic standpoint, you know, ProPublica, the AI Now Foundation, Data for Democracy, AI for All, a lot of these organizations are already doing that. They're doing it in a broad way. ProPublica has wonderful content about the social implications of the compass system, what happens when you put two people who, you know, a white person and a black person who stole something. Guess what happens when sentencing comes in, right? It's really ugly, and they show you exactly how that happened in case studies. So to some extent, so that data, that information about how it works is out there. There's a wonderful book by, there's a wonderful book called Algorithms of Oppression. There's another one called Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill that really lay out what, and by the way, which anybody can read, it's a really easy and great read about, an audiobook too, on the impact on education, on the criminal justice system, on healthcare, and so on. So so that information is out. It takes leaders who have the guts to make a call, and it takes people near those leaders who have the guts to speak truth to power. So from a public standpoint, from a business standpoint, you know, I think some of those issues are a little bit more challenging, right? Because it's not that, you know, you could pick Mark or you could pick any other executive in the Bay Area or really around the world and say, well, you know, each person has their own sets of values, their own things that they're known for and that they focus on. But even so, even with the best intentions, to drive that through an organization is a lot of work. So I think it takes people like us, frankly, to be raising those issues, to be speaking for them, to be speaking about them, and then actually, you know, because not all of us can see everything that happens or have experienced everything that happens, it takes or being able to have what are really awkward and uncomfortable conversations with a little bit more, you know, courage than you normally would. Because, you know, I'll tell you, like, as a white woman having this conversation, like, I will tell you, I'm usually in a state of panic when I get up in front of a group of people, because I don't want to speak for people, but I really do want to make sure that whoever's in this room who's in a decision-making capacity hears me, and so that somebody else doesn't have to be the person to do that. So, for whatever that's worth.
I'm curious. Did anybody in the room watch the Senate questioning Mark Zuckerberg
The algorithms are going to fix it.
about? Did anybody watch that in the room? Raise your hand if you watched it. Okay, some people watched it. Okay, good. The reason why that whole process and the questions that the people who run our country, like, they were asking the most basic questions of Mark Zuckerberg. Like, these are the people who run our country. If those are the smart people who are running the country, we're in deep trouble, okay? Because, you know, even, you know, a lot of people that I talk to, they don't believe that, like, social media or these types of technologies, these data-driven technologies, can actually influence people. They don't really realize they're being influenced by these technologies. So I think that making sure that the education around technology to the youngest people at all levels of our society is very clear, and the implications of data and the power of data and the fact that data should be powerful for all the people, not just a few of the people. Until we get to that point, I don't think we'll be able to make those corrections in those really difficult centers where power is very centralized. And, you know, what we're talking about right now, I think, with you know, public policy and really trying to encourage people to get out the vote, is we're trying to get people engaged on this. And I think that's also the reason why we're having this conversation today. We're trying to get everyone engaged in the conversation of data, the power of data, the power of AI, and the importance of using that technology ethically. And until we can get everyone on the same page, then we're on unequal footing. And that's the problem that you were pointing out. So we have to all work together to get everyone on the same page.
Can I just jump in on your, I think where there's the most hope around understanding the ethical implications of use of AI is actually in government, because there's an accountability issue with government, and there's voters, and people can protest things, and there's a follow through that actually does not exist when you're in the private sector, absence regulation or something like that. So I think it's going to be hot, and it's going to be messy, and it's going to be complicated, but I think the ability to unpack what algorithms, how they're influencing our decision making in government is actually higher than it's going to be in the private sector. And to the extent that you think certain companies are influencing and shaping the public coming from the private sector, I think that's where our thorniest, most complicated pieces are going to be from a public policy perspective. And I'll just note on the public sector, on government side of things, the way we should be thinking about AI is a great way to unpack what is often a black box of decision making already, the human brain. And so if we can get this out into something that's actually audible and traceable, there's potentially significant power there to have much stronger accountability in government if we do it right. And a few of the early mistakes are allowing private companies like Compness to be like, our algorithm's proprietary knowledge. We can't tell you how we're deriving that decision. That is actually unacceptable. Governments need to develop the right contract clauses that never allow us to buy an algorithmic mediated software where we don't have access to that in some form or fashion or another.
Yeah, hell yes.
Can I ask what the next step is? Because I have to disagree with you respectfully, and that is I want more police in neighborhoods that are more dangerous. I think for managing limited resources, we want early responders where people who are at risk are. And so what I want to find out is the next step of AI that and benefits from the bias in such a way that it does good. How do we get there?
You want to do that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to be really clear on a couple of things, and I really appreciate your comment because, I have cousins who are in law enforcement, right? And they risk their lives every day to protect us. I think that's really important, right? This is a part of the fabric of our society. But inherently, when we use the term bias, like look up bias in the dictionary. Bias means it's wrong. It's incorrect. It means it's incorrect, right? So something is not right when something is biased. It's skewed. So when we think about society and we think about people and we think about equality, we want to treat people equally. And if our technology and our systems are not doing that, then that's a problem. If our systems of government are not doing that, that's a problem. And I think everyone has their own opinions around like how we should actually put these things in place, and that's why our democracy is so incredible and we should all participate in our democracy. But we really need to be really clear about, what we mean when we say bias.
So I think we're at time, and I imagine hopefully everyone will stick around after. So I guess just if we can end on a point of optimism or kind of something that each one of you can just share like a few sentences on, something that you feel positively about or that, you feel you want to convey to everyone here about where this is all headed.
Sure. I'll just maybe I'm going to handle that a little differently, which is that we've been talking a lot about what I would call societal bias. There's either a history of a certain group being targeted. So the problem with policing that neighborhood is that we've chosen certain laws and we've chosen to over police certain people. So now all of our data tells us to keep policing them more, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that I'm in favor of Target increasing their marketing budget to sell me things such as lipstick. I don't need those kinds of people. I would rather
Yeah. so now you're getting to like the point of, let's understand the implications of what this bias might be targeting, right? And if it's life, safety, economic future, we need to be super careful. And so I'll say that. But where I wanted to go with this is, we've been talking a lot about societal bias, and that is so important, and we should be talking about it. But the other ethical implications of use of AI are a couple of things. Inappropriate use of data. If data is being collected for one thing and then we go use it to do something that is very different and unexpected from the user perspective, that's an ethical dimension that we need to be thinking about. That's one. And then accountability risk. If we can't explain, like, to what degree is the algorithm making the decision, and what does that accountability risk? If we can't describe who's making what decisions, and what are the implications of that decision, and what's the recourse if we disagree with that decision, that's another ethical question that we need to explore in our use of AI. So I just want to, like, societal bias is a huge piece, and it's absolutely a huge piece, but we have to understand these other ethical pieces and think about how we're going to mitigate and manage the ethical risk from that as well. So that's less of a, and more just food for thought for future conversations.
Okay, I'm going to do one quick semi-societal, semi-business risk story. So there was an article in The Atlantic not too long ago profiling a doctor who was concerned about the impact of AI on diagnosing skin cancer, particularly in non-Caucasian people and people who have darker skin tones, the terminology they used. And the issue is that doctors don't know how to diagnose skin cancer in people with darker skin tones because they don't see it as often, because it's not as common. But when it does present, it is typically much more serious. And so this doctor was concerned that if we use algorithms and we use the data that we have, then what we're going to do is end up amplifying and improving the diagnostic capability of doctors to find skin cancer in Caucasian people, and that anybody who is not Caucasian is going to be at a much higher risk and much higher potential mortality. So, but what he said was, I don't think AI is bad, I just think it needs to be inclusive. We know our data's biased because we know we don't have enough data on people of color. So maybe I'm going to make a partnership agreement with some hospitals in different countries in Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia so that we can have a data set that reflects the entire spectrum of human skin. And so that we understand what lesions look like across the spectrum of color. And if we can do that, then we don't have to expect people in economic situations to, prioritize going to their dermatologist quite as much, because maybe that's not the top priority that they have. And we can offer low-cost digital diagnostic and treatment services to people who would not otherwise have had this opportunity. And I think it's a wonderful thought experiment to think about. If we can remove or mitigate bias to a point where it is better, right? Because we're starting from a pretty low bar in some of these situations. If we can do that, imagine what the potential is actually to serve people who, whether it's healthcare, whether it's financial services, and you were talking earlier about unbanked folks and coming up with credit scoring for people who are unbanked, and what are the attributes, what are the things that you can look at. That to me is the real opportunity, is the imagination around, if we can stop allowing the data to tell us what our future is going to be, then we can decide what we want our future to be.
Love it. And I mean, I just want to say, I'm really excited to have everyone here, really proud that everyone is here and vested in this conversation. The point I would like to end on is that as human beings, we can always go in two different directions. We can go in a direction of fear, which is oh my God, here's what I don't want to happen. Here's where I want to put the stop button on, right? And sometimes we're creating AI for that. So if we're creating AI to identify risks so that we can avoid making certain decisions or lock certain people out of different opportunities or not invest in certain people, that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is, how can we use AI and data to help everyone move forward? How can we use it to help everyone progress? How can we use it to improve the positive outcomes of all of our constituents? That's the much more powerful question. And so I would like to see more of us focusing on that side, because if we do that, we can actually create a more equitable society for everybody by the power of AI.
All right. Thanks so much to the panelists. Fantastic discussion.
Thanks, everybody.